Okay, so I've started the recording now. We've introduced ourselves, kind of checked everybody off as far as the roster goes. So thank you for introducing yourselves and telling us something about yourself. So it seems like we kind of have a mix of finance, medicine, some computer science, and we'll try to touch on all those topics as we go through the course. Um, let's start on the discussion of the course materials, so particularly the Blackboard site, talk about the syllabus a little bit, talk about my stat lab. So let's jump over here. You can bring up the Blackboard site at courses.ccac.edu along with me if you want, or you can just follow along on the screen. And this is the Blackboard site for the course. So this is kind of the main clearinghouse for things like announcements, for document sharing, for that kind of stuff in the course. The homeworks and so on will be on a different site, My Stat Lab, but the all of kind of the administrative and logistical stuff will be handled through the Blackboard site. Uh, so hopefully you saw the two announcements. Presumably, since you're here, you saw at least one of these two announcements or the Zoom tab. When I need to send out any important information, I'll usually send it out with a Blackboard announcement similar to this. It should be copied to your CCAC email and will be visible on Blackboard. And you can just find that in the announcements tab. I've also posted a useful websites tab with some useful websites as I suggest. Some folks tend to miss this, but the YouTube playlist for previous semesters, I've also included in here links to those. So, if you want to see a previous semester's class, if you, for instance, maybe you want to work ahead a little bit or something like that, you can feel free to look at those. And then as we go through this course, typically within a day or so, I will post the recording to YouTube. And I don't have a playlist made for this course yet or for this section yet, but I'll probably list that one just right underneath this one. Oh, one more thing on this tab. We will be using Microsoft Excel in this course. That'll be kind of the main non-calculator piece of technology we use. The book uses something called StatCrunch. I don't particularly like that because StatCrunch really is only for like this book and this course. But Excel, pretty much any computer you log onto will have Microsoft Excel on it. So it's much more adaptable to different computers. And if it's a little bit of a steeper learning curve, but if you learn it, it's not much of a steeper learning curve than StatCrunch, and then you'll recognize it on any computer. Um, so one additional note, we will be going through examples in Excel throughout the course, and I'll be showing you some things on Excel. But if you want to get up to speed in a little bit more of a kind of like traditional and formulaic manner, rather than just kind of watching what I do and copying and maybe Googling a little bit here and there, um, there's an Excel supplement on Coursera, which is a massive open online course website. You can click this link, and as I mentioned here, the material in weeks 1, 2, and 6, I think, are probably the most helpful for the course. Um, and you can get access to it for free using the audit course option. Sometimes they like hide it. It's like a little link below the like pay us a bunch of money for this course, but you can just audit the course and then you can get all the instructional material that walks you through Excel kind of much more formulaically. So if you're the kind of person who likes to experiment, try something out, see how it works, Google it a little bit, then maybe just follow along in class. If you're the kind of person who wants a very structured and methodical approach, maybe this will work for you. And again, don't pay them money for it. You can just use the audit course option, and it will give you all the instructional material, and you can go through a much more formulaic process learning Excel that way. And I also mentioned that only some of the weeks will be really helpful for this course. There's a lot of material in there that we won't really be talking about in this course. We have the syllabus tab. We'll come back to that in a couple minutes here. Um, Under course documents, if you click on that, you'll notice that there's just a note that says complete semester start test first. And above that, you see that there's semester start test. In the course documents will be the information how to log on to My Stat Lab, this Pearson course where we'll have the assignments and the exams in the course. So in the My Stat Lab course. Sometimes I call it my math lab, sometimes I call it my stat lab, sometimes I call it my labs, which is the new name for it. But all of them talk all of the different ways I refer to it really mean this same this same place here, the Pearson's My Labs course that we'll talk about in a little bit. So all of our assignments and exams, anything that counts toward your final course grade, will be in Pearson My Labs slash My Stat Lab. I tend to call it My Stat Lab because that's what it used to be called. So I taught for years calling it that, and then they changed to My Lab Statistics or something. And um, but once you complete the semester start test, and as an aside, this is just it's a test, so to speak, but really what it is it's pointing out 10 what I think are the most important policies in the course that I want to make sure you're aware of. So there's just agree or don't agree or something like that choice on each one of them, and just click agree to each of them. If you uh, if you have a question about any of them before you agree, send me an email, let me know, and we can discuss, or I can give you more information. Um, and I think it's important to note, and I say all this here as well, but uh, clicking agree on any of these is not any further agreement than is implied by you staying in the course. It's just my way of making sure that you understand all of these points that you've implicitly agreed to by staying in the course. These are all points covered in the syllabus. And by staying in the course and continuing with the course, you implicitly agree to all the policies in the syllabus. But I just want to make absolutely sure that certain points are understood. So that's really the purpose of this. When you complete the course policies agreement, when you agree to that under the semester start test, you will see these two links pop up. So there's the MyStatLab student registration instructions with the instructions on how to get onto this course here. And then if you bought an access code through the bookstore, which I generally don't recommend, it's kind of a big hassle. But if you're using financial aid, unfortunately, you have to go through the bookstore to use your financial aid directly to buy access. Um, they give you a printed on a receipt, or they give you an email with an access code, which unfortunately is not the access code for my stat lab. So you have to like log into the bookstore's website, enter that access code, and then that generates a my stat lab access code. See why I say like to avoid that if you can. Um, that's what this down here is for. So if you want to just use a credit card and buy straight from Pearson, it's cheaper. It avoids the hassle of the bookstore. And that's the kind of recommended route. But if you need to use financial aid for your books or for your course materials, and you go through the bookstore, this bookstore print on a receipt instructions, take a look at that. They should have also sent you the same instructions, but just in case they didn't, that's
Uh,
there.
Excuse me, Professor, how
Yeah.
did you get to that tab?
Yeah. So the kind of a side note with Blackboard, they they sometimes collapse this menu to the left. If you see when I'm scrolling back and forth over this bar here, sometimes you see the bar with a little left arrow and sometimes you don't. If you click that, it makes this menu go away. So depending on the size of your window, sometimes this menu will be shrunk off to the
No,
left like this.
no, I
And
was saying in course documents, when I click on that, it doesn't say like where you were explaining how to go about getting a book or registering. How do I
yeah,
get
so
to that?
so that's the
Okay,
semester start test, right? So you complete the
okay,
semester start test, the course policies agreement, and then you
okay,
can see these two.
okay. All right, thank you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so and under course documents, the first thing listed is just a note. It just says complete semester start test first. And once you complete the semester start test, you'll be able to see the registration instructions. I just popped it into instructor mode here so that I could show you what it'll look like once you go through that agreement. But again, I do it this way because, and this was another faculty member that recommended this to the discipline. It actually is a really good idea, just to make sure that folks know the important policies in the syllabus. And because I mean, I know that all of us instructors say read your syllabus carefully, take notes, like make notes of the important policies, but that doesn't always happen. The first week is pretty busy, and you might be starting 4 or 5 or even 6 courses, all with different syllabi and different policies. So this is just here both, for you to initially kind of, I guess, to point out the most important points of the syllabus, and also you could come back to it later if you want to know like what were the important points. I also have a textbook information document here, includes information for our textbook. Um, this is one semester old or one version old, but our textbook, elementary stats using Excel, this is the sixth edition I'm holding here, but we have a seventh edition now um, that we have for this course. There are some other textbooks that I like. My favorite stats book, if I could teach out of any stats book, this would probably be it. This Prim Man book. Um, so introductory statistics, you can probably find this at this point on in the secondary market for $5 or something if you get an older edition. Um, but that doesn't have like Pearson, MyLabs, and WebAssign are the two ancillary systems that really work the best by far. And unfortunately, that's not a Pearson or Cengage book. Um, and then there are these Shams outlines. So like this Shams outline of statistics, or similarly, there's the so-called Humongous Book series as well. And what Shams and Humongous Book are is kind of like they're like problem sets. So for technical courses, they're really nice, whether it's math or different courses where the elements are more technical and maybe like less in the humanities. Um, so what they'll do is they'll introduce an idea with a really short blurb. They'll walk you through maybe 5 to 10 problems just from, problem statement, every detail working through the problem and then completing it. And then they'll give you maybe 5 or 10 problems where they give you the problem statement and the answer, and you fill in the work to get the answer and you can check your answer. Um, so for students who just really like the kind of drill it a bunch approach to learning, like if that works for you, just kind of drilling the same problem a lot of times, a lot of those students like the Shams outlines or the Humongous Book series. And the other nice thing is they can be had very cheaply. I want to say, you can usually find them used for maybe $5 or $10 or something on Amazon. I think new they're maybe like 25 or 30 or something like that. The prices might have changed. I don't know. These might be, you know, we've had some inflation the last couple of years, if you've noticed. Uh, but they're certainly not as expensive as a normal textbook, and especially if you go at one edition older than the most current one, you can get them pretty cheaply. A couple kind of entertaining books are this one, Statistics You Can't Trust. It's kind of set up almost like a like comic, I guess not comic book style, but it's kind of a little fun book. And this one, How to Lie with Statistics. So it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek, like really it's trying to show you all the ways that people can mislead you with statistics, but it's kind of framing it from the standpoint of how you could mislead others. That's just kind of a tongue-in-cheek joke. And then some topics that we'll be covering, uh, kind of skimming over in the course. If you're interested in going into greater depth, there is this, I get these out of order, I guess, but primer of biostatistics. So if you're going into the medical field, the bio fields, this is a really nice book. Again, this is like, I think this one's the sixth edition. It's probably up to the ninth or 10th edition now. You can find an old edition for super cheap. It's just a relatively short little paperback, but it's going to take things like confidence interval and hypothesis tests, which we'll cover. Um, it's going to take kind of a half a step further. So not like a whole course further, but just a little bit further than we're going to go, right? And it really, dives into it through the lens of like what are the most important ideas for actually like reading biology research, reading medical research, understanding topics in those fields. And then for the folks who are more in the kind of business side of things, this one, undergraduate econometrics, is really nice for regression analysis. Regression analysis, it is used in medicine, actually. Actually, my wife and I were talking about an issue that they're having with one of their tests that's kind of struggling right now. And we were talking about how actually an issue with the regression modeling could be either part of the problem, or if you do it a little bit differently, it might help diagnose the test. We can see, is this is the problem over here or over there. So understanding regression, which we'll touch on again very lightly at the end of the course, maybe two class sessions. This undergraduate econometrics takes that maybe a half a step further, doesn't require any calculus, which is which is a very nice part of this. But if you're interested in taking some of these stats ideas that we'll touch on and applying them in the business and economics fields, I think that's a really nice book. So again, just some resources on this page. And then instructor information, some ways to get in touch with me. I have not set my office hours yet. So after today, um, we're kind of still looking at whether we're going to add sections for late start and so on. But after the next couple of days, I should know what my teaching schedule is going to look like finalized, and then I can set my office hours around that. In the Zoom tab, there's a little primer on Zoom in case you haven't used Zoom before. It gives you a little bit of information. And then Zoom links here. You see the test link, the link for our class meetings. And then when I set my office hours, I'll post the link here for my office hours. Sometimes I have to post two links if I do like different times on like Monday, Wednesday, or Tuesday, Thursday, or something. Sometimes it works better to post two different links and one for one set and one for another set, and sometimes it works better to post one. So uh, take a look back here for office hours. But usually folks don't really attend office hours the first week or so. Usually there aren't too many questions. But if you do ever want to meet via Zoom, either this week or in the future outside of my office hours, just send me an email. We can usually set up a meeting that will work. Okay, any questions so far before we touch on the syllabus? All right. So in the syllabus tab, there are three documents: syllabus, workflow pointers, and CCAC boilerplate. We'll cover the second two first because they're pretty quick. The um, the whoops, the workflow pointers document is this one: class workflow and workload expectations. And a lot of students will kind of struggle the first time that they take an online course or a Zoom course because there's just something psychologically, I don't know, maybe our psych majors can evaluate this, but there seems to be something psychologically about when we're not meeting in person, folks tend to get off schedule a little bit easier with things like homework and so on. So this is just, these are some of my thoughts on how you might want to set up your approach to the course. So setting up a pretty rigid schedule that you follow, making sure that you touch on the material, often and for a shorter period of time is much better than, say, trying to do all of the homework on Sunday evening right before it's due. You're going to learn the material a lot better if you work, an hour or two a day, 5 days a week, than if you work, 10 hours on Sunday. Um, and then at the bottom here, we have, oh, actually, I need to update this one, but at the bottom, there will be a learning outcomes section, and that's for our accreditation people. So I actually need to update this one because I haven't taught this course on Zoom in a little while. So that's something I need to add to the end here. I don't think students really care about that kind of stuff at all, but they say that students care about it, so we put it on there. We also have some syllabus boilerplate here. I try to pull this out so that we can have really the main focus, the main focal points in the syllabus itself, and then this kind of as an appendix. But this is all of the kind of CCAC boilerplate stuff. So, things like uh, drop and add information, um, incomplete grade information, students with disabilities policies. If you have, if you want a disability accommodation, reach out to our supportive services folks, and make sure that you have all the paperwork in order and that's sent over to me well before the first exam. If I don't have that paperwork, I can't grant an accommodation. They're the folks who will look into all that and grant that for you. So all of this is kind of the CCAC boilerplate stuff. So of course, it's important stuff, read through it, but it's stuff that really applies across the college to any course, rather than specifically this course. So, and then in our syllabus, we have kind of all the policies and procedures that are specific to this course. The first page is just our all of the material we'll be covering. Statistics covers a lot of material, so this is a pretty long first page relative to what some courses have. We'll meet Tuesdays and Thursdays, 10:20 to 12. And I generally do start right at 10:20. We started a couple minutes late today because I wanted to let people kind of filter in. But we will typically start right at 10:20 and plan to go right up until 12. If I'm still going strong and it's like 11:58 and if you think I haven't seen the time, send me a little chat message like, hey, we're getting close to the end. So I want to be respectful of your time. But yeah, we typically will go, start right at 10:20 and go right up until about 12. Um, the book for the course I already showed you and we discussed. Some required materials for the course. So graphing calculator is strongly recommended. We won't be using the graphing component that much, but the ability to kind of see all the numbers. If you think like you want to average 10 numbers together, you have to add 10 numbers together in parentheses and then divide by 10. It's much easier to check your work on, say, a graphing calculator where all of that computation is all on the screen rather than say, a calculator where you're doing like one number at a time and you enter the first number plus and you enter the second number and then the first one goes away, right? It's just much easier to check your work on a graphing calculator. And the graphing calculator has some stats functions that I'll show you how to use maybe here and there throughout the course, and that you might want to use. So, not uh, not a graphing calculator isn't required to do the work of the course, but it's just strongly recommended. But some kind of calculator, you're going to want to have. Regularly check your academic email address through CCAC. So if you tend to use an academic email address through another institution or a Gmail account or something like that, at the very least, make sure your CCAC emails are forwarded and check your CCAC email every once in a while to make sure that your inbox doesn't fill up too much. But I would say, just check it once per day or at least, once per class day to make sure that you're on top of, anything anything that announcements or anything I need to send out to you. Access to my stat lab is required, so we'll talk about my stat lab in a couple minutes here. Uh, we will be using Excel, Microsoft Excel. If you have it on your computer, great, you can just use that version. If you don't have it on your computer, um, you can use CCAC's NetID access to get whatever, to get access to like Office 360 or whatever it is. And I think you can get Excel on your personal computer that way. I don't recommend using Google Sheets. I know it's kind of, you know, it's a little more like accessible to everybody to have. Everybody has a Gmail account and you can just get into it, but it does work a little bit differently than Excel. So some of the function names or some of the ways to do things are a little different. So I do recommend using actual Excel. And again, if you don't have it on your computer, you can get it through our our IT folks at CCAC. And then, of course, the ability to connect to participate in Zoom meetings. So things like a webcam. You will we'll talk a little later about this, but we're using HonorLock, a third-party online proctoring platform. So you will need to be able to have a webcam on, have a microphone working, etc. Stable internet connection, all of these kind of things that in any remote course, these would be expectations. Read through the syllabus carefully. I'm kind of hitting the high points as we go along here. We'll have 3 exams, a Unit 1 exam, Unit 2 exam, and a final exam. They're worth 20% of your course grade each, and then homework is worth 40% of your course grade. All of those, the exams and the homework, are on my stat lab.
I have a question
Yeah,
about
sure.
back when we were for registration. Uh, for registering to my stat lab, where would that be exactly in Blackboard?
The my stat lab information, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's what's under this course documents. When you complete the semester start test, then you'll see the MyStatLab student registration instructions. Then you can use those instructions to get onto MyStatLab.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, it's not so some faculty build their MyStatLab link right into Blackboard. I don't do that for a couple reasons. One, it makes things a hassle on my side to, add or change assignments or anything like that, because you know, now you've got two pieces of tech that need to work together. And if either one or both of them break, then the whole system breaks. Where if we use MyStatLab standalone, then we only have one piece of tech that needs to work in order for the system to be up. So, and it's also, you know, a little bit more challenging for students to, um, let's say, like for students to access MyStatLab once you get it set up, if it's built into the course. This way, it's a little bit difficult to set. It's a little more difficult to set up on the front end, having it as standalone. But once it's set up, it's easier for you to access. You don't have to go through a Blackboard to access it. You can just go straight to Pearson's website, and uh, and if Blackboard happens to be down for some reason, you can still get to it just fine. So, so that's kind of why it's set up that way. So again, some other important things. Again, there will be three exams, two unit exams and a final. These will be proctored through HonorLock. You can find the dates of the exams all the way down at the bottom of the syllabus and the course schedule. So you see there's Unit 1 exam week with the Unit 1 exam material, chapters 1 through 3, Unit 2 exam week, chapters 4 through 6, and the final exam is only on chapters 7 through 12, so only on the material after Unit 2 exam. And then there's also an HonorLock practice exam. So once we kind of hit our stride in the course, we get a couple weeks in, I'll post the HonorLock practice exam, and that doesn't count for your course grade, but it's just kind of a dummy exam to let you go through the HonorLock process, make sure that all the tech is working, make sure everything is working together properly, and that your computer is up to handling it. And that's a couple weeks before the Unit 1 exam. So if any issues do come up, we have time to sort them out. As a general rule, HonorLock really works great for students. Students rarely have tech issues with HonorLock. There are some systems out there that really aren't very good. So one of them is ProctorU that students have a lot of problems with, but HonorLock tends to work very well for students on a lot of different platforms and so on. And when students do have tech problems, it's usually that they're trying to use, maybe an unsupported browser or something like that, basically not following the instructions that HonorLock gives. So, um, yeah, but we'll talk more about HonorLock a little later in the course. But you know, that's again, that's an online proctoring platform. It uses your webcam, your microphone, screen sharing to proctor, so you don't have to come on campus or do anything like that. That kind of defeats the purpose of our remote course if you have to come on campus, several times throughout the semester. Okay, you can request due date extensions on homework, but one of the most important policies, which I've pointed out a couple of times in the syllabus and in the semester start test, you're required to take the exams when they're scheduled. The exams, each of the three exams is open for roughly a 1 week period, and you can take it anytime within that period. That's another benefit of HonorLock. If it works better for you to take it on a Tuesday at 2 a.m., go for it. That's perfectly fine. Anytime within that period that the exam is open, you can take it. But there are no due date extensions. So make sure that you plan for that. Make sure that um, give yourself a buffer. Don't wait until the last day or even the second to last day of the window to take the exam. Plan to take it, a few days ahead of time, maybe the evening of the third day before the due date. And that way, if anything does come up, power outage, a technical glitch, anything like that, you have time to get that sorted out or find an alternate way to take it. Um, I think that's one of the biggest things I want to point out is that there are no due date extensions on exams. So make sure that make sure that you're planning to take the exams not at the end of the window, but that you schedule yourself a time. You don't have to schedule a time in HonorLock or anything like that, but internally to yourself, schedule a time that's well in advance of the window, and that gives you a buffer, that gives you some margin if anything happens to work out either a solution or an alternative way to take the exam. Um, okay, so for the exams, you can't use, uh, you know, computers, websites, phones, things like that. You can use a calculator. You can use any calculator that's only a calculator. So if you like a simpler calculator, if you want to have that on your desk as well as a graphing calculator, that's fine. It doesn't matter if your calculator has a computer algebra system. So, basically any graphing calculator you buy is fine as long as it's only a calculator. And you may also use Excel and or StatCrunch on the homework sets and on the exams. So, for the exam, for the homework sets, some of the problems will have more data. They might have 50 data points or something. And those are the ones you really want to use Excel for. You can feel free to use Excel for some of the ones with smaller data points too, if you prefer. I do recommend, doing some problems by hand just to kind of get a feel for how all of the math works. Um, but for the longer problems, if you see a problem with 50 data points, you need to compute an average, you should probably use Excel for that. Or, if you need to compute a standard deviation and it's like 15 data points, that's going to be really cumbersome to do by hand. Use Excel for that. The same thing goes for exams. You can use Excel, although I tend to, I really try to not put problems on exams that um, that are infeasible to do by calculator. You know, it might be easier or more efficient or less error prone for you to do that problem on Excel, but you shouldn't more or less be required to. But you can use Excel if that's your preferred way of doing the calculations. And then we have some AI policies here. There's an AI policy that I wrote that's more specific to this course. And there's our official math discipline-wide AI policy. Um, the way that I think about the use of AI, it's tricky when you say AI, right? Because you can't just say you're not allowed to use AI in the course or something like that. Because, heck, I mean, autocorrect for spelling these days uses AI, or grammar correction or whatever. So it's like, well, what AI are we talking about? It's really difficult to draw a line on this continuum and make it very clear. But the two things that I would say is number one, if you think it's in a gray area, you're not sure, just reach out and ask, and I'll clarify. And number two, are you using the technology as a tool or as a crutch? I think that's really the big question. Um, if you're saying I'm asking AI to do this and I wouldn't be able to do it myself, you're probably using AI too much. If you're asking AI to do something and you couldn't explain to me each of the steps to complete the problem, you're probably using AI too much, right? If you're using AI certainly to give you the answer for, say, a homework problem or something that's graded, that's definitely using AI too much. But if you go to ChatGPT and you say, hey, I'm working on problems, finding areas under a normal distribution curve. Can you generate 10 problems for me with examples, for an introductory level statistics course? That's fine, right? Uh, so so AI is tricky. I would generally, as kind of a general rule, say lean to the side of not using AI rather than using it. But I know that that's not, you know, that's not too popular these days. So if you want to use AI as kind of an exploratory tool or to help you learn material, that's fine. But once you get into kind of like helping you directly with homework or certainly not helping you on an exam, that's where it gets into the academic dishonesty side of things. And if you think, okay, well, I can have it help me on the homework, but I just won't use it on the exam. Well, what you do on the homework is training your brain for how to think for the exam. So um, you don't want to use it on the homework and then, realize on the exam when you get a 10% on the exam that you didn't actually know the material as well as you thought you did. The purpose of the homework is for you to identify weaknesses in your understanding, go correct them, and then verify that correction with repeating those homework problems. And then we have our course outline here. So roughly what we'll do each day is listed on here. And this tends to shift around a little bit as we go through the course, but shouldn't shift around too much. Okay, any questions on anything? Okay, I see I have one chat message. Yeah, yeah, there are like the large language models like ChatGPT and Gemini. There are, you know, kind of like specific use chatbots that people have made. Um, yeah. So there's there are things like photo math, like does optical character recognition count as AI, right? Um, but yeah, so there's kind of this almost continuum, and it's hard to say very clearly where to draw the line. Uh, so that's why I just kind of during exams you can't use any of those tools. You can only use the tools that are explicitly allowed. Calculator, it's only a calculator. Excel or StatCrunch, and then of course the Honorlock website, the MyStatLab website, and things that are built into those directly. Um, so for homeworks, leaning more towards that is a good idea. For learning the material outside of homeworks, if you're reading through the section in the book or something, and you say, I find this a little confusing, and I want to ask ChatGPT about it, or ask ChatGPT to, you know, give me a couple of extra practice problems or something. I don't think there's a problem with that, but also be aware that, you know, the information it gives you might not be 100% valid. Um, but that being said, if you ask a human, the information they give you might not be 100% valid, right? People tend to point out the mistakes that AI makes, but humans make mistakes too. So if you go into a tutor, or heck, if you ask me a question, I might make a mistake. So we all make mistakes. Um, but we just have to, keep in mind that we should always be questioning. You should question what I say. If something doesn't look right that I say, I might have made a mistake, or I might need to clarify that. So, okay, so any questions up to this point on things like the syllabus and so on? We'll talk about MyStatLab in just a minute here, but any questions to this point?
The exams, is there like a hourly time limit? Like, oh, this person
No.
usually takes like 2 hours, but if they take three, will I be penalized at all?
Yeah, so the exams do have a time limit. Typically, our Unit 1 and Unit 2 exams are an hour 40, because that's how I kind of, titrated the exam to be one class length. And then the final exam, essentially by college policy, is set to 2 hours. And then, folks can have things like supportive services accommodations. They could change that, but that's the default times. Yeah. And those times are enforced through the MyStatLab system. So it'll just, close out the exam when the time is up.
Okay,
Any
thank
other questions? Okay, so let's look at MyStatLab quickly here, and then we'll talk a little bit about statistics. So everything is a pop-up these days. Here, well, we'll do that because you just pop up stuff randomly in front of me. Um, anyway, all right, hopefully that makes it through. Um, I feel like I spend half of my time doing anything hitting these little X's, just finding little X's and hitting them. Anyway, sorry. Uh, insert gripe about Microsoft. When you go to MyStatLab again, you log in by completing the semester start test, just kind of agreeing to those important topics in the syllabus just to make sure you're aware of them. That'll open up the registration instructions. You do get a 2-week free trial for MyStatLab. So even if you don't have an access code, or want a couple days to work out the financial arrangements, that's no problem. Just log on anyway this first week and get started. We have a first assignment up. It is due this coming Sunday. And it's just kind of, it's 10 questions you can easily look up in the book and just kind of answer. It's more just to get you into the system, get you acclimated. Um, the first assignment, if we click on it, it has unlimited attempts. So the first couple assignments will have unlimited attempts, and then starting in chapter 2, I think 2.1, and for the rest of the course, it'll be 5 attempts per question. So 5 attempts, is probably a reasonable number. Um, if you haven't gotten it right in 5 attempts, that's that probably means most students at that point are just kind of guessing, and that's not really a fruitful endeavor. Um, but for this, for these first couple, as we're getting acclimated to the system, if you want to mess around with the system and say, what happens if I do this or what happens if I do that, you have some extra attempts there. Um, and we can click on the questions. That opens up our question browser here. One of the really nice aspects of a course like this is you get immediate feedback. So we got that one right. Oh, I lucked out on that one. I've been choosing them randomly. Let's see. What's the chance I get 3? So, and if you get an incorrect one, it gives you a little bit of a prompt, right? Um, so in a traditional math class, you kind of write out all your answers by hand. You hand them to me in some class meeting, and I hand them to you back to you 2 days or 5 days later at the next class meeting. Yeah, and you find out maybe a week after you completed the homework question that you did it wrong. Here you get immediate feedback. You can correct the misunderstanding. Sometimes it's just an error, right? And you just correct it and you get the right answer. But sometimes it's a misunderstanding, and you can correct that misunderstanding immediately before you practice things the wrong way, say 10 times. Um, you'll notice that there's nothing you have to do to like submit an assignment when you're done with it or something. Everything is kind of live updated. Question 1 and question 2 are right. You got 20% on this assignment. You know, if I as a student walked away and did nothing from this point on, I as the instructor would see 20%, and that would be the score for this first assignment. You can keep working on the assignment until either you run out of attempts or until the due date, and there's the due date listed there. So that's this coming Sunday. There's a lot of other stuff you can poke around in here and look through, but that's the main thing. Is in the assignments tab is where you'll be going to do the homework assignments. They'll kind of list, the new assignments will be at the bottom. So as we get to, section 1.1, section 1.2, chapter 2, those will be kind of listing, going down the line here. And then when I post exams or sample exams or anything related to exams, I post them at the very top. That just makes it a little easier for you to find them, so you don't have to kind of like sort through all of the assignments. So the exam stuff will be at the very top, and then the assignments will be start being listed, down. So the newer assignments will be down at the bottom. Any questions on my stat lab?
No
Okay.
question.
Oh yeah. Mhm.
Oh no, I was just saying no question.
Oh, no questions. Okay. All right. So that is our discussion of the course materials. Um, I'll talk more about details related to exams, how many questions, what material covers, those kind of things as we get closer to the exams. But outside of, details related to exams, is there any question on anything administratively or logistically related to the course?
Yes, Professor.
Yeah.
Once we're set up with the My Stat Lab, are we good to go? Like we don't have to set up anything in Blackboard after that?
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. So you're automatically enrolled in the Blackboard site. So you can just log on to Blackboard either through the portal my.ccac.edu, and there's a link in there, or you can go directly to courses.ccac.edu, and that takes you straight to Blackboard. And you log in with the same username and password you'd use for like email or anything else at CCAC, and that gets you into a site that looks more or less like this. And again, with that annoying kind of tab on the left, sometimes you have to to click this little bar over here to pop it out. Um, I thought my site the first time that happened, my window was a little too small, and I thought my site was like broken because I'm like, I can't find any of my navigation things until I Googled it or something, and it's like, oh yeah, there's this little bar over here that you have to click. Um, but yeah, you should automatically be in Blackboard. And then again, if you complete the semester start test, just pointing out those important uh, policies from the syllabus. Go to my Stat Lab student registration instructions, and again, you can log on today with a 2-week free trial and work out how to pay for it later. Um, then then you can come over to my Stat Lab, get started on the first assignment. I'll probably post in the next couple of days. The next couple weeks of assignments. I usually post about a week or two of assignments ahead so that if folks want to work a little bit ahead, they can. But I don't recommend working too far ahead. And the My Stat Lab access is required for the course. So it's basically in lieu of a textbook. In some courses you would just buy the physical textbook and that would be your book. Here it's access to the My Stat Lab system. We have a question in the chat. Will we be learning the content in the first assignment in Thursday's lecture? Yeah, we're kind of, we're going to go through chapter one. Chapter one is kind of like just a very qualitative introduction to some ideas and statistics so we can spend more or less time on certain areas. Yeah, but definitely, today and Thursday, we'll be kind of introducing some ideas and statistics and, we probably won't get through too much today, but then Thursday we'll kind of, pick up where we leave off today. Okay, let me switch my screen share around here. Just make it a little easier for y'all to see. All right, so you should see just my OneNote page now. So it should be a little bit bigger, a little easier for you to read. Oh, and there's one more topic that I want to talk about that I think is important to talk about before we get into some discussions of ideas related to statistics. And that's really related to the idea of, what is a college degree? What's the value of a college degree? What is the purpose of general education? Things like that. So I think in statistics, people mostly see the utility, but some people might say, well, maybe I'm going into a business degree. I don't see how statistics is absolutely necessary for that. Or, people say this a lot more typically in, say, an algebra class or something like that. But what's the goal of a general education or kind of a core course or a course that's not like a major course, right? If you're going into accounting, you take ACC courses, you take accounting course, and you're like, obviously that's going to help me be a better accountant. But there are other courses like maybe art history you have to take, or maybe biology, and you say, how does this help me be a better accountant? And that's the idea of a general education component or our core component. This is as opposed to, say, program related or program specific coursework, like, say, an accounting course and like financial accounting or managerial accounting in an accounting program, or, anatomy and physiology in a bio program. Which, by the way, apparently, if you take A and P as an undergrad, that gives you a huge leg up in med school because a lot of folks in med school haven't taken A and P. So, I mean, if you're going to med school, take A and P in undergrad. Why not, see it before not have your first time be in med school when you're being pulled 1,000 different directions. But side note. But anyway, so why do we take these general education courses? And that's part of the idea of what is maybe you're looking to get an AS degree or a Bachelor of Arts degree or an Associate of Science degree or something like that. That's really what that degree means. It means program specific coursework coupled with a general education component. And I like this quote. This is from a movie called The Truman Show that had Jim Carrey in it, although it wasn't like his usual goofy comedy kind of situation. And basically, the show was about his life. It was like a modern, reality show, except it was a real reality show. He was born in this enormous movie set or TV set or whatever, and he didn't know that he was in a TV set, but everybody else that he had ever interacted with were all actors. And these, it was this show where um, he like grew up in this environment, and there were all kinds of hidden cameras, um, and at some point, basically somebody asked them like, how does he not know that he's in a TV show? Like, how has he not figured this out after 30 years or something, right? Like strange things happen every once in a while. And Christoph says, we accept the reality of the world and with which we're presented. It's as simple as that. And I think that's a really important idea is, um, there are many different ways of thinking. There are many different experiences that different people have coming from different backgrounds. And part of, for instance, becoming a lifelong learner, or part of being able to access different modes of thinking, is being exposed to them. It's not just all of the logistical aspects that people like to point out that, oh, well, if you're an engineer, but you write an email that has a lot of misspellings, maybe you won't get the contract because people won't trust you. It's like, well, maybe studying literature has a benefit outside of that, that you'll interact with people who, have built a life out of studying literature, and you want to understand how they think, and you would like them to understand how you think so you can interact and communicate better. Or people who are, were brought up in a different culture from you, or, maybe 5 miles down the road in a different socioeconomic situation than you. Um, so understanding that there are many different worlds, and, being presented with more different worlds and different modes of thought than you might encounter in your little narrow niche, is, I think, a very valuable aspect of education. And it's also an aspect that you're unlikely to get if you just pursued this on your own, right? If you just said, I'm going to, buy all of the accounting books and read through them, yeah, you could be, a good accountant doing that probably. But, um, but I think you would miss out on a lot of the richness of what a degree actually brings. So that's my kind of couple minute defense of education and the liberal arts and the general education curriculum. And stats kind of straddles, it's kind of program related for most people, but it's maybe not as central as, say, a bio course or an accounting course or a business course or something. Okay. An interesting question to think about as an aside is, what does it mean to know something, right? Like, that something is true, but somebody else thinks that just the opposite is true. So, like, who's right? How do you know that you're right when they think, just as strongly that they're right? Does that mean that they're crazy? Does that mean that they're dumb? Does that mean that you're working off of different evidence that you've seen? What does it mean to know something, and what does it mean to learn something? So, um, I think all related ideas, but we'll move on. I could talk about anything forever. So that's right. I mean, that's part of being a professor, I suppose, is uh, being able to rattle on about a bunch of random topics. Okay, so let's jump into statistics. And for the sake of time, I think I'm just going to kind of give you what I think is a good working definition of statistics. I think the book has some long, paragraph long definition that's not even really a good definition, I don't think, but the working definition of statistics, at least the way that I think about it, is it's the process of converting nearly useless raw data, and we'll say what we mean about this in just a second, into a more usable form. And some aspects of statistics, maybe at first glance, don't do this, but the end goal is always, we're building up this maybe mathematical background so that at the end of this, we can convert nearly useless raw data into a more usable form. So even though we'll be covering some stuff in the course that doesn't seem directly related to this, the end goal is always to build up this structure and then leverage it to do this. And so what's an example? I have a couple kind of go-to examples just because they're very tangible, very understandable. And for example, let's say we're interested in heights of Pittsburghers. So we're interested in knowing something about the heights of people in Pittsburgh. And let's not dig too deeply into what do we mean by a Pittsburgher, people who are in Pittsburgh now, or people who live in Pittsburgh, or people who work in Pittsburgh. Let's just leave it at this. One thing we might do is we might go out and, you know, uh, maybe people will give us a little bit of a strange look, but we might just ask 100 people. We just walk around, pick on random people and say, can I measure your height? Or what is your height? And from that, I obtain a list. Maybe one person's 5'10", maybe the next person is 5 feet tall, maybe the next person is 6'1", right? And I get this list of just, I'm interested in knowing about something about heights. So I got to just measure a bunch of heights. This is my raw data. I'm interested in something, I got to measure it, and kind of the most direct result of that measurement is what I typically call the raw data, or sometimes we'll call it our data set or something like that. Now, this isn't too useful to me, right? If I have 100 of these, or particularly if I have maybe 10,000 of them, like I just have pages and pages of numbers, usually I want to do something with this. So maybe I'm interested in saying, well, I want to build a new bus seat. I want to design a new bus seat, and I want most people to be able to use it. And let's say that I think that height works with bus seats, somehow, or we might want to measure like the, hip to knee length or something like that instead. But, we're not worrying too much about the very specific details here. So I might take this raw data, this list of, say, maybe 100 or maybe 1,000 or maybe 10,000, just list of numbers that my brain can't really work with very well. And maybe I'm interested in knowing, say, what's an average. That in some sense, like what is the typical height of the typical person in some loose sense? Maybe it's like 5'7". Or maybe I'm interested in how tall is like a pretty tall person? What's the height where I can say only 1 in 20 people, for instance, is taller than this? Or I might call that the 95th percentile. And I'm making these numbers up, but maybe the 95th percentile for the whole population of adults is, who knows, maybe 6'2" or something like that. That's probably even a little on the high side. And then from there, I might say, well, how should I design my seat? I could say 95th percentile of the data set, or the average height of the data set. I could be talking about the average height of all people in Pittsburgh. And then how should I design my seat? Should I design it so that a 6'2" tall person is comfortable? But that means 5% of people are going to be uncomfortable. Should I design it so that 99% of people are going to be comfortable, but that's probably going to cost more money, right? We can fit fewer seats in the bus, or the bus has to be bigger or something. So we kind of have this hierarchy. I'll write it kind of in reverse order. We have our raw data. It's kind of the closest to the ground, so to speak. It requires the least interpretation. It's just what we directly measured, but it's effectively useless for making decisions. If we go up the scale, and I'm using kind of roughly my own terminology here, there are several people who have kind of taken a stab at how to define this idea. But if we go up one level of processing or understanding from raw data, we have information. We might call this like descriptive statistics. So the average height of our sample, of our data set here, is 5'7". Right? That might be information we can glean from the raw data. And then from there, we might be able to infer something. I only measured 100 people or 1,000 people. I didn't measure all of the Pittsburghers, but maybe I can use the folks that I measure, the information I do have, or the data that I do have, to make an inference about something that's true of all of the people that I did not measure. This is inferential statistics. And we'll talk more about all these terms a little later on in next class. But this would be like average height of all Pittsburghers is 5'7". And then above that, we have wisdom, which is basically what to do. Statistics helps us work our way up this hierarchy. Statistics does not help us with wisdom, right? Should we spend more money to design a seat that's more comfortable for more people? I don't know. Stats doesn't help us with that, right? Maybe morals or maybe values or maybe cultural norms help us with that. So we leave that to philosophers and pastors and those kind of folks to discuss what we should do, what we ought to do, what our terminal goals ought to be. But we use statistics to try to work our way up this hierarchy, going from the raw data, what we directly measure, to something we say about the data itself, to then hopefully something that we can build as essentially a model of reality that goes outside of the data we collected and gives us something informative to work with in the wisdom sense. So that's kind of our goal with statistics. When we come back next time, we'll talk about some applications of statistics. So maybe, over the next day or so, jump onto Google or look into where statistics is used in your field, some examples, and then come back with some examples or applications where statistics is used in your field or just in something you're interested in for next time. But that wraps us up for today. Let me stop the recording.